There is a story told of a famous politician who is visiting a senior facility, stumping up the votes, and he's a little upset, a little perturbed because the staff are not treating him with the appropriate respect for his station, his career, his rank. And he says to them, "Do you know who I am?" And one of the residents pipes up, "Don't worry, if you're not sure, ask one of the staff and they'll tell you." So, at one point, I think many of us thought we were heading towards a time and a place where who you were, the color of your skin, your faith, your way of life, might have been important to you, but didn't matter in your place, in your path in the world. When you look back at the book of Exodus, you see what would seem to be the exact opposite. There arises a new Pharaoh who does not know Joseph. So Joseph and his brothers are living large in Egypt, literally living off the fat of the land. That's where the expression comes from. They are successful, they are happy, and there's a new Pharaoh who arises and demonizes them and says, "They are too numerous. They are going to support our enemies. We need to beat them down. We need to make sure that they are not too prominent in our society." And he says, "Pen your bet, pen ye froats." What will happen if they get bigger, if they get more numerous, if they get more powerful? And of course, the challenge is that the more that they are abused, the more they grew. The more that they were picked on, the more that they were denigrated, the more they excelled. And so finally, Pharaoh resorted to ruthless cruelty, resorted to attempting to kill his foes. It would seem to be that in this world of hate, in this world, Pharaoh, in some ways you could say, was the inventor of anti-Semitism, of saying, we hate Jews not just because we hate other people. Yes, we hate the Hittites. Yes, we're not fans of the Amorites. No, we don't really like the Canaanites very much. But the Jews are special because we are afraid they're going to overrun us. And so Pharaoh creates this world where it seems that there is no confusion. You're either for us or against us. There are no shades of gray. But in fact, when you read the story of the Exodus carefully, what you find out is there's actually a surprising amount of confusion about who is who. So it begins with the Me'aldot ha'ivriot, the midwives of the Hebrews. So Pharaoh, in an effort to keep down the Israelites, says to these midwives, "You know what? I'm going to ask you, kill all the Jewish boys when they are born. Leave the girls alive. We can use those. But kill all the boys." And they are called the Me'aldot ha'ivriot. The rabbis say, these are the Hebrew midwives. These are Jewish women who serve as the midwives for the Jewish people. As Nate mentioned this morning, the rabbis even say maybe one of them was Moses' mother. But the Torah singles them out for their courage for standing up to Pharaoh. Now look, it takes a lot of courage to stand up to Pharaoh, whoever you are. But to set them aside, what do you know? The Jewish midwives did not want to kill their own children. Doesn't really stand out. And in fact, a number of the commentators say that you're parsing the grammar wrong. You have to put the comma in a different place. They are the Me'aldot ha'ivriot. They are the midwives for the Hebrews, but they are themselves Egyptians. And so Pharaoh, why would Pharaoh go to the Hebrew women and say, kill your own children? To go to these Egyptian midwives and say, look, you know whose side you're on. You know we are proud Egyptians. Do this for the cause. And yet these women stand up to Pharaoh, first in a subtle way and then in a more profound way, and they refuse this command. They refuse to be bystanders. They refuse to be collaborators. We see Egyptian women standing up for the Israelites, and we see it again with Pharaoh's daughter. So she is at the epicenter, and she brings an Israelite boy into her home. How did Moses get to be in the river? How did he get to be, if you will, a basket case? Well, the legend goes as follows, that Pharaoh's astrologers say to him, you know, the one who has the ability to overthrow your dynasty will be born at the season, and fun fact, Moses is born in Adar in the sign of Pisces, and so therefore the person who destroys you will only be vulnerable to water. And so then after the midwives refuse, Pharaoh says, you know what? Throw all of the boys into the river. Rashi, the classic French commentator, notes that it doesn't say throw all the Hebrew boys, it's just throw all the boys into the river. And so in fact, we can imagine, Rashi pictures that the Egyptians are so committed to the cause, are so committed to preserving their supremacy, are so committed to Pharaoh's command, that not only are they throwing the Jewish boys in the river, they are throwing their own. So how did Pharaoh's daughter know that this child she found in the river was an Israelite? Could have been something that happened on 8 days after he was born, but in fact, we know that the Egyptians were circumcised as well, so that's not it. Perhaps what it is was that the Egyptians were actually happy to throw any baby into the river, so anyone who was willing to save a child had to be an Israelite. And so you see this idea of Pharaoh's command that if you are motivated enough by hate, when the conflict comes strong enough, no one is safe on one side or the other. And so if you look at what is going on, even as we speak, 6,000 miles away in Gaza, if you look at the aims of Hamas, that their goal, that killing people on our side is great, but they also win every time there is a death on their own side. That is why their tunnels where they keep their munitions are underneath schools, are in hospitals, because they have shelters for their soldiers but not their civilians, for their weapons but not for their medical supplies. And so when you are motivated enough by animus to people who are not like you, even your own side suffers. But in fact, that blurring of one side and the other reaches its apex, reaches its height in the character of Moses himself. So you look at Moses. Moses has lived his whole life in the palace. Moses, according to the legend, he is 40 years old. The first time he has this awakening, he has this reckoning. He looks outside and he realizes there is bad stuff happening to the Israelites out there. I had no idea. He looks and he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, and he realized, wow, they don't like us very much out here. You know, if you don't know who you are, ask one of the people out there and they will remind you. So we live in a time, we live in a place where, as Jews, we are being reminded who we are, perhaps in the way that Moses was. So if you follow what has been happening in the streets of our cities, on the internet, but especially on campuses, what has been brewing, that which was present beneath the surface, hatred, animosity, bias that has been brewing, is now out in the open. So looking out at the crowd, many of us may remember, I think some of us, there's actually one person here with whom I was friends on Friendster. True story. I may still be, for all I know. I haven't checked in 14 years. But many folks around the room, it's Facebook, it's Instagram. I had an issue a couple of weeks ago where my blood pressure was a little bit lower than it should be. My doctor says, don't worry, just look at Twitter, it'll come right back up. But there is a new social network called Side Chat. And what is great about it is you can say all the horrible things that you would say in social media, but now it is anonymous. And so actually Rabbi Bright forwarded to me recently a list of some of the most horrible things that have been said on Side Chat about Jews at Harvard in the last few weeks. And what was funny is I have a child who's there who forwarded me some of the funnier ones already. But they are really remarkable. So I'm not going to repeat them all here, but things like, I am proud to be called a terrorist. And so we live in this world where things that may have been once said in quiet, that may have been once said in hushed tones, are now said in the open, and especially with that courage that comes with the cowardice of anonymity. So what ended up happening at Harvard was that there was a president who was not able to handle what was happening on campus and eventually was toppled. There is, however, a problem. As Yoda would have said, begun the plagiarism wars have. Because in fact, what has come to the surface is that we live in a world where a lot of people hate a lot of people. And the fact is that universities have recently been doing a terrible job, thank you, being a terrible job of protecting Jews from hate, but also don't do a great job of protecting a lot of other kinds of people, whether they are African American or otherwise. And there are efforts in place that you have seen that have attempted to do better, and a lot of them unfortunately have ended up having, in fact, exactly the opposite effect of what was intended. So perhaps there's another sermon to talk about what's wrong about DEI, about how it should be done better, because in fact there is racism in this world that needs to be fought. But we're now beyond that. We're now at a point where people on both sides who are looking to take advantage of this conflict are looking to score points, and they don't care who falls on one side or the other. And I'm particularly sensitive as I talk to some of my friends who are Jews of color, that in a world in which the interests of Jews and African Americans are pitted against each other, absolutely no one wins except for the people who hate both. So one option that I suppose we have is to withdraw. We say we are no longer going to be a presence on campuses where Jews are not welcome. So in fact, about a week ago, I sent a sternly worded letter to Harvard saying that I had withdrawn my previous pledge and I was sending them $1. So their endowment is now $50 billion and $1. And I am sure that that letter has affected significant change. But the fact is, the challenges that are faced not just at Harvard, but elsewhere in the academic world, will not be resolved by running away from them. Moses runs away to Midian. And when he gets to Midian, what he finds out is that when the daughters of Jethro see him, they say, "You know who saved us? An Egyptian man." Even though he has thought of himself as Israelite, if you don't know who you are, other people will tell you. And so it's funny, when I go out in the world, about once a month, I believe it's in my contract, I'm allowed to remind the congregation once a month that I also went to Harvard. But when I look out into the world, right, I don't win when the place where I went takes a hit either. And so I think what we need is more midwives. We need more people who can be honest about what is being done wrong, but can also find ways to reach across and say, you know what, we should not be throwing all the babies in the Nile. So the truth is, Jews cannot run away from elite universities. No matter how hard you try, the crimson tide will never be the crimson. Go blue. Because in fact, we are in the midst right now of a battle for the future, and what you saw in December and January is just a preview of a spring where I don't know how anyone is going to get any studying done. And has often been the case in some of the worst conflicts in the world, whether or not we started it, Jews somehow being in the center. And so I actually have been interviewing this week. We have put out a new job posting. We are looking for a director of community connections. We are looking for someone who is able to take our growing community and find people and make sure that they feel at home, make sure that they find their people. If you are a person who loves genealogy, we have your people. If you are a person who loves magic, we have your people. If you are an LGBTQ Jew, you have your people of B'nai Torah. If you are a Jew of color, you find your people here at B'nai Torah. And amongst the people I've interviewed are two who said, you know, I worked in the university world, I worked in the corporate world, and I realized that where I work is not a great place to be Jewish. So sometimes we don't know who we are until someone reminds us. The Jews could not have been taken out of Egypt without Moses. And as Nate mentioned, one of the things that made Moses special was he grew up in the palace. He could live in both worlds. He could speak the language of the Hebrews, and he could speak the language of the palace of the elite. And only Moses could speak both languages and could therefore speak the words of freedom. But Moses didn't know who he was until someone reminded him. Shabbat shalom.